question period. Question orale, the Honourable Whip for the official opposition.
Boo-hoo, get over it. That was this NDP Liberal government's response to serious questions about members of this House cooperating with hostile foreign powers. The Prime Minister was briefed on the threat of foreign interference for years, since at least 2020, and he did nothing. It's time for him to name names listed in the foreign interference report. Who are they? Will the Prime Minister do the right thing and reveal whether any of his cabinet ministers are on that list?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, Conservative members know what actually happened in committee that day, but when it comes to foreign interference, this is something we take incredibly seriously. It's something we have taken seriously since we formed government, something that unfortunately Mr. Harper's government did not do. We have put in place measures like the NSICOP committee. We are currently debating C-70 in committee, which will bring forward more provisions to help strengthen our democratic institutions. I hope Conservatives will stop playing political games and instead focus on resilience in our democratic institutions.
The Honourable Member for South Surrey White Rock.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the surest way to have resilience is to also have transparency, and that is not a credible answer. Our sovereignty is at stake. Our first duty is to Canada. There is only one acceptable answer, and it's not to tell Canadians, boo-hoo, get over it. That's unserious, unhinged, in fact. It further proves that this corrupt government is unfit to lead this country. Can someone, anyone over there, stand up and tell Canadians today the names of the MPs working against Canada? Yeah. We're waiting.
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, that member knows full well that we do not share secret and highly confidential intelligence on the floor of the House of Commons. And I would simply point out the series of measures, beginning with the creation of NSICOP, and the series of other measures that have been put in place by this government over the past years to combat foreign interference, a problem that countries around the world are dealing with. This is a problem that is being confronted extremely seriously by this government and not in a partisan way.
Hear, hear. The Honourable Official Opposition Whip.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians are sick of secret meetings and secret outcomes. This is foreign interference at an unprecedented level. Canadians deserve answers and clarity. This corrupt NDP Liberal government's lack of political courage in the face of hostile foreign actors is a disgrace. Yesterday, we honored our D-Day heroes, soldiers who stormed beaches under fire and died for our freedoms. The least we can do to honor them and their memories is to stand up for Canada. Come clean, release the names, at least tell us if they're sitting in your cabinet.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety and Democratic Institutions.
Mr. Speaker, we have always taken the issues of foreign interference seriously. This is precisely why we've implemented a number of measures in dealing with this. Mr. Speaker, what we've also done is ensured that leaders of the opposition, including the leader of the official opposition, is provided the clearance to review all of the documents unredacted so that he too has clarity on the national security elements of this information. Mr. Speaker, we are not going to politicize this. We are going to ensure that information that is of national security importance, that is dealt with in a secure manner.
L'honorable député de Louis.
The Honourable Member for Louis Saint-Laurent. Mr. Speaker, foreign interference is a very serious matter. The report from the committee is clear. Here in this House, we have elected officials who were elected with the support of a hostile foreign state. People need to learn who those MPs are. They need to be identified. Because otherwise, we know that the situation won't be fixed. The Prime Minister could do something about this. When will he? The Honourable Government House Leader. Mr. Speaker, my colleague knows very well that this government has to respect our national secrets. These are serious national secrets. We will continue to do so. the member has not treated the measures that this government has brought in seriously enough. For example, the creation of the National Security Committee of Parliamentarians, which has reported on the situation. Countries around the world are facing this type of interference. Canada is a leader in this matter, and I think colleagues in the opposition should take the matter very seriously. The honourable member for Louis Saint-Laurent. Well, what would be properly serious would be if this government told us that which members were elected under foreign influence. Meanwhile, there's also the matter of crime. Over the last 9 years with this Liberal government, crime has gone up around the country, especially in urban centres. In Laval, crime has increased by 10%. In Montreal, 112,000 offences last year. We're battling with the problem of crime, and criminals are ending up on home arrest instead of behind bars because of C5. And the Bloc Québécois also voted for C5. When will the government do something to actually make sure that criminals end up in prison, not relaxing at home? The Honourable Government House Leader, Mr. Speaker, this member knows perfectly well that our government has faced crime throughout the country with substantial reforms on crime. We will support our police forces, provinces, and municipalities. Who are doing a great deal to fight crimes like auto theft. We will not take lessons from the Conservative Party on this. They have no crime policy. We do. The honourable member for Salaberry-sur-Roi. Mr. Speaker, we've been told that members in this House are working for foreign powers, but yesterday at committee, a Liberal member told parliamentarians, boo-hoo, get over it. And then the Deputy Prime Minister on Wednesday refused to answer questions on this topic because she preferred to talk about the interest rates. Our democracy is under attack, but the Liberals are not acting like the adults in the room. We're all responsible that ensuring that members who are not working for their fellow citizens are shown the door. Will the Liberals finally take foreign interference seriously? The Honourable Government House Leader. Mr. Speaker, I'll repeat this for the Bloc Québécois. Once again, we've taken a number of measures to fight foreign interference. Many countries, France, the UK, the US, are all facing foreign interference. That's well documented. Canada has presented a broad series of measures on this matter, including the Committee of Parliamentarians that have studied it and have published a report. This government is facing up and taking responsibility, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member. Mr. Speaker, as parliamentarians, we cannot be satisfied by what the Liberals have done. It's just not enough. Clearly, since MPs, we now know, are under foreign influence. And the Liberals shouldn't just try to shove the problem over to the RCMP. The RCMP has its hands tied because very often conniving in favor of foreign powers doesn't necessarily mean you committed a criminal offense, but it is disastrous for democracy. Will the Liberals pull themselves together, carry out some kind of inquiry on their end, and kick out any two-faced members within their ranks?
I appreciate the Bloc members on the committee who have been working hard and diligently with us in good faith on foreign interference. It's disappointing when, conservative mischaracterization of meetings takes place. But, Mr. Speaker, what's most important is that we are working hard to ensure our democratic institutions are resilient, that we are combating foreign interference. This is not a partisan issue, Mr. Speaker, and it's why we've introduced a number of measures, including C-70, which we're working on committee, to strengthen our democratic.
L'honorable député de Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie.
The honourable member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Mr. Speaker, in May, the average monthly rent in Canada reached a record $2,200. It's a record. In Montreal, $2,300 for a two-bedroom. For decades, the Liberal and Conservative governments have allowed rich developers speculate with the housing market. People are drowning. What will it take for this government to finally prioritize social and affordable housing, not the profits of rich developers? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for the question. As he knows very well, in the federal government, in the federal budget rather, we have made historic investments, and we have announced a new co-op program with the highest level of funding in 30 years for co-ops in order to create off-market housing, non-market housing, and we will work with all of our partners to create more housing, for example, in Montreal.
For Vancouver Kingsway.
Mr. Speaker, people in Vancouver Kingsway are really struggling to find a home they can afford. A two-bedroom apartment costs over $3,600 a month, the highest in the country. The average renter is now spending 60% of their income on rent, double the recommended amount. This is the result of decades of underfunding by Liberal and Conservative governments. The Liberals are failing to meet this moment, and the Conservatives offer slogans instead of solutions. When will the Liberals start building the affordable, non-market homes people need and deserve?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
We are doing exactly that, Mr. Speaker. We share an interest with that party in building more non-market homes. That has to happen, and that's why the budget of 2024 supplemented existing programs that will make that happen. On the issue of rent, he raises this, and he should. We do have an expensive situation when it comes to rent in Canada, and that's why this government is responding by putting in place innovative measures that will lead to more building, lifting GST on the construction of purpose-built rentals, putting in place measures to allow for low-interest loans by the private sector, measures that each of the Conservatives do not support, Mr. Speaker. They're not serious.
The Honourable Member for Carlton Trail, Eagle Creek.
After 9 years, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost or corruption. Liberals don't want Canadians to know what they already know. Canadians are worse off with the carbon tax. A secret government report proves the carbon tax costs Canadians more than they get back. But the government has forced their budget watchdog to sign a gag order so that he can't share that information with Canadians. When will this Prime Minister quit using unbelievable talking points and release the secret report that proves Canadians are right?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
That member of Parliament, Mr. Speaker, knows full well that many years ago, the parliamentary budget officer said that 8 out of 10 Canadians were better off under the carbon pricing policies of the government.
That's right.
Today, the parliamentary budget officer says 8 out of 10 Canadians are better off under the carbon pricing policy of the government. That member, however, ran in the last election, walking around Carlton Trail, Eagle Creek, promising to put a price on pollution. She sure did, and now she opposes the doubling of the growth in the rural rebate.
The Honourable Member for Carlton Trail, Eagle Creek.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I absolutely did not do that, and you can talk to my constituents. The parliamentary budget officer has already proven that the Liberal carbon tax, just like this Prime Minister, is not worth the cost. The PBO has been clear. The vast majority of Canadians are worse off under a carbon tax than without it. And the Liberal secret government report proves it. The analysis has been done, but the government is blocking its release with a gag order. When will this Prime Minister come clean with Canadians, stop hiding the real cost of the carbon tax, and release his secret report?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, we've learned something rather astounding this morning. This member just denied that she ran under the Conservative Party of Canada's platform in the last election. However, there she sits as a member of the Conservative caucus. I think Canadians can now ask any member over here, what parts of the Conservative platform in the upcoming election will they be subtracting themselves from?
Question.
Will they be disassociating themselves from? The Conservative platform applies to all the members. Bulletin, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Oshawa.
Mr. Speaker, after 9 years, this NDP Liberal Prime Minister is simply not worth the cost. When asked about reaching their climate goals, the Liberal member for Whitby admitted that their policies knowingly would be difficult and painful for Canadians. Now we know that their carbon tax climate policy confirms this, as documented in a secret report which is covered up by putting a gag order on their budget watchdog. When will this government quit using their unbelievable talking points and release the secret report that proves Canadians are right?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Campaign platforms are not a buffet. All of those members on the Conservative side ran on a commitment to price carbon with Erin O'Toole, and just because they've abandoned those commitments, it just demonstrates very, very clearly they have no integrity and no desire to fight climate change or lower our emissions, Mr. Speaker. But let's look at what the PBO actually said. And I quote, "Carbon pricing is the most effective way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions." Mr. Speaker, the PBO has...
Order. I can't hear the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, so I'll allow the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to finish up there.
I can't either.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And if I could finish, the PBO concluded that carbon pricing is the most cost-effective way to fight climate change, and Canadians will receive their Canada Carbon Rebate on July 15th, which supports affordability. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Oshawa.
Mr. Speaker, I guess this member ran on a platform of record cover-ups and corruption. Because Canadians are sick and tired from this NDP Liberal government, they silence anyone who doesn't go along with their narrative. This government is covering up for Liberal insiders benefiting from exploiting the Green Slush Fund, the shameful inappropriate awarding of contracts to McKinsey, and covering up the names of MPs involved in foreign interference. Mr. Speaker, now they are silencing the Parliamentary Budget Officer. So I'll ask again, when will this government release this secret report that proves Canadians are right?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Well, that member knows full well the PBO said a long time ago 8 out of 10 Canadians were better off, and today he says that 8 out of 10 Canadians are better off. But my question for the Honourable Member over there, because now that we have a la carte election platforms, I'd like to know if he approves the leader's affirmations with respect to contraception, with respect to a woman's right to choose, and while he's at it, he could maybe explain to this House what was discussed at that lunch with the extreme right German legislator that he attended.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Confederation.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians trust the independent and impartial Parliamentary Budget Officer. This is likely because the PBO shows their homework instead of relying on the old just trust me routine. We also know because of the PBO that there exists government data showing what the true cost of the carbon tax is, but this Liberal NDP government doesn't want to show their homework. It is contained in that secret report. In fact, the Liberals have gone so far as to gag the PBO from telling Canadians about it. Why don't they just release the report?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, except that's not what the PBO did, and that's not what the PBO said. What the PBO said back on April 17th is that they overestimated the economic cost of climate change. That means that all of those acts, the tax rallies, are based on faulty math, Mr. Speaker. This is just another reason for Conservatives to deny climate change. Denying the effectiveness and proven impact of carbon pricing is another form of climate change denial, Mr. Speaker. The Canada Carbon Rebate will be in mailboxes and bank accounts on July 15th, Mr. Speaker. We support fighting climate change and affordability on this side.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Confederation.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians want to see that secret report from the PBO on the true costs of the carbon tax. Canadians no longer trust this government. They no longer trust this MP. They no longer trust the Prime Minister. Canadians want the data. They want the facts, and they will determine the truth. Canadians don't believe that they are better off because of this carbon tax. They are struggling daily to survive. Why doesn't this government trust Canadians to make a fair assessment and release that secret report on the true costs of the carbon tax?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Innovation.
Let's have a review of what the PBO actually has said. So in Power and Politics, Mr. Giroux said carbon pricing is seen by most economists as the most cost-effective way of reaching levels of carbon emissions reductions. Just recently on March 27, 2024 at OGO Committee, Yves Giroux also said there is a wide consensus among economists, and he said, I am an economist, that carbon pricing is an effective way of reducing carbon emissions. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Giroux has claimed over and over again, reiterated that carbon pricing is effective.
The Honourable Member for Terrebonne. Mr. Speaker, this week the Auditor General published 3 reports. They all say the same thing as before. Once again, contracts without bids for tender, conflicts of interest, and general negligence, yet again. And in fact, in the first report, there's only one recommendation, which is just follow our recommendations. The Auditor General is tasked with protecting the management of our public funds, and yet she's clearly exasperated. Do the Liberals realize that every AG report shows that they are incapable of managing the affairs of state?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question. I also appreciate the work done by the Auditor General. We thank her for her recommendations. We are all concerned about ensuring that there be transparency, accountability, and integrity in all the work that we do. And there have been recommendations made by the Auditor General and the Ombudsman and a number of others that reinforce the concerns that the government shares. And that is why some of this stuff was initiated. So we'll take every step necessary to provide proper training to ensure that we have taken the steps necessary to provide integrity in the system as we go forward. Thank you.
The Honourable Member. Well, Mr. Speaker, whistleblowers, repeated warnings, criticism from a high-placed official. There were red blinking lights about SDTC, and that's been the case for a long time. Conflicts of interest, non-eligible projects being approved. Once again, taxpayer money being squandered. The department knew, the minister must have known, they had received documents with the conflicts of interest, but nothing was done. Would the minister have abolished SDTC if the AG hadn't published such a devastating report?
Innovation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the honourable member for the question. We know that SDTC for over 20 years has done great work to support the clean tech sector. Obviously, there were allegations of mismanagement. When those were surfaced, the minister acted immediately to issue several independent reviews, both on HR practices and governance practices. We know, and we've always been unequivocal about the fact that we need to demand the highest governance practices from independent organizations that are dealing with public funds, and we are moving forward with a new governance model and framework that will restore proper oversight.
The Honourable Member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Employment has a 50% stake in a shady company that has been ordered by Alberta courts to pay $7.8 million for ripping off clients. Someone at the company named Randy is implicated in a $500,000 fraud. Now, the minister claims he isn't that Randy. Okay, but like the company has 5 employees and no one can find that Randy. So if the minister isn't that Randy, who is?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, as we all know, Canada has among the stringent conflict of interest and ethics dispositions and measures in the world. Ministers are expected to comply with all of those, and the minister answered that specific question yesterday.
The Honourable Member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the minister claimed he isn't that Randy on the basis that he turned over his phone records. The minister did no such thing. Rather, he very conveniently turned over the records of a single device. So, can the minister confirm that the device he turned over, the records of the device that he turned over, are from the minister's business burner phone?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, we were all here yesterday when the minister gave a comprehensive response to the very thing the member raises, so I can only refer him to that statement.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Nose Hill.
I mean, it's a little sus, right? Like, come on. I mean, you've got a numbered company, a 50% stake, and then a mysterious other Randy stepping up to take the blame. I guess, did the minister bother asking the employment minister who the other Randy was, what his last name was, before he held the bag for him today? Thank you.
The Honourable Government House Leader.
I know members strain to come up with original ways of asking the same question. I note that that's the case in this instance. The minister responded comprehensively to this very issue yesterday, and I would remind the member that, and I would refer her to that statement.
Hear, hear. The Honourable Member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Well, newsflash for the government, we wouldn't have to ask the same question. over and over again if what? The government answered the question. Wouldn't that be nice? He's so nice. So I will try once again. This is clearly sus. I can't actually believe that the Minister of the Employment had the audacity to say other Randy. So if there is another Randy, what's his last name?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
I'm glad the member had a chance to consult the Urban Dictionary this morning, but I would again refer her to the minister's very comprehensive response yesterday.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Mr. Speaker, the arts inspire us. They enrich our lives and they add so much to our community. We need to support them. But this Liberal government has been underfunding Edmonton's art scene for years, and local artists and our community is struggling. Cities with loads of Liberal MPs are getting as much as 4 times as much as Edmonton does per capita. This partisan politics is hurting Edmonton's creative scene. When will this government stop punishing Alberta and start funding our arts?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Health.
Well, thank you very much, Speaker. I want to thank the member opposite for a very important question. I agree with them. Arts is extremely important for all of us individually, for our communities, for our country. And there's so much of Canadian arts and culture to celebrate, which varies from region to region. And that is why we will continue to support arts groups, our artists all across the country, regardless which part of the country they live in, including Alberta. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Victoria.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday Canadians who've experienced devastating climate consequences were here in Ottawa. People who have lost their homes to wildfires, lived through severe flooding, and whose communities are threatened by rising sea levels. They called on the Liberals to meaningfully cap emissions from the oil and gas sector. The problem is, the Liberals are still bending their knee to oil lobbyists. Yesterday, the oil and gas CEOs went so far as to say, the cap is so low it's unnecessary. First, they water it down, and now they want to scrap it. Will the Liberals stop listening to lobbyists and strengthen the emissions cap?
Hear, hear. Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank some lobbyists, actually. I'd like to thank the Canadian Citizens Climate Lobby. I'd like to thank the David Suzuki Foundation. I'd like to thank that member for her question. And I'd like to thank all of the climate activists and all of the folks across Canada who are concerned about the extreme emissions of the oil sands sector. And Mr. Speaker, we're not just listening, we're taking action. We're actually the first oil-producing country in the world to put a cap on greenhouse gas emissions from the oil and gas sector. And yes, Mr. Speaker, yesterday at Environment Committee, we had those CEOs, we held them to account, we asked them what their plans were to lower emissions. I'm sad to say their answers were insufficient. Mr. Speaker, climate advocates.
The
Honourable Member for Lac Saint Louis.
Build them faster. We know that municipalities need funding to accelerate the construction of critical housing infrastructure. Through our new Canada Housing Infrastructure Fund, we're going to help them do just that. Can the Parliamentary Secretary for Housing, Communities and Infrastructure share our plan to support the municipal infrastructure necessary for homes to be built across this country?
Good question. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing.
Mr. Speaker, that member has served this House since 2004, always interested in issues of water, but also water infrastructure. I thank him for the question. We have put in place measures to support more home building, but we can't do that without thinking about housing enabling infrastructure. Wastewater, stormwater, solid waste infrastructure, all of these things add up and they make a difference. They make communities possible. That's why this government has put $6 billion forward for provinces and municipalities. There's conditionality attached. If provinces want access to the funds and if municipalities want access, they have to freeze development charges and they have to make sure that more missing middle homes get built, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Sturgeon River Parkland.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Employment claims that he's set the record straight and that he's not the other Randy who is conducting business at a fraud-ridden company. But he's failed to answer the most basic question. If he's not the Randy in question, who is Randy? Now, the answer to this question will reveal the truth and put to rest any questions about the guilt or innocence of the minister. He could easily pick up the phone and find out the identity of this Randy. So why won't the minister finally end the charade and tell us who's Randy?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to once again reiterate for my honourable colleague that the minister comprehensively responded to this question yesterday, and under all elements under his purview, and I would refer the member across to that response.
The honourable member for Sturgeon River Parkland.
Mr. Speaker, all the denials and rhetoric in the world will not change the very basic fact that we need the answer to the question. Who is Randy? It's a simple question. Who is the Randy referred to in the text messages from the Minister of Employment's former business partner, Stephen Anderson? Now, the minister has admitted at committee that he talks to his former business partners. So why won't he pick up the phone and find out who's Randy? And if there truly is another Randy, I will rise in this House and apologize. But until then, I'll keep asking, who's Randy?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Well, this is question period. The member can ask whatever question he wishes, and the answer, of course, is the same one that I just gave him, that the minister very comprehensively responded to this yesterday. The minister submits to the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Code that is among the most stringent in the world, and I think we presume all members of this House to be honourable, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear. The Honourable Member for Kelowna Lake Country.
After 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, it's more expensive to rent in Canada than ever. And the top two most expensive places to rent are in my home province of British Columbia. Vancouver is #1 and Burnaby is #2. In Vancouver, it now costs over $2,600 to rent a one-bedroom or a staggering $3,600 for a two-bedroom. Canadians' quality of life continues to drop. Food bank usage is at record high and tent encampments are growing. This Prime Minister is not worth the cost. When will the Prime Minister build homes, not bureaucracy?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing, Communities and Infrastructure.
The member, Mr. Speaker, mentions housing, mentions affordability, mentions getting people off the street. We share those interests. Unfortunately, her voting records show something entirely different. She should go to 651 Cambridge Avenue in her riding of Kelowna to see a project funded by this government that she voted against, unfortunately. She talks about encampments. They don't want to deal with encampments. They have nothing in their housing plan, so-called, to deal with homelessness. She talks about building more. They want to apply a tax on home builders, Mr. Speaker. They don't want to apply any measure to the housing crisis. They're not a serious party. It's all slogans.
The Honourable Member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Well, Mr. Speaker, housing starts are down, and under this NDP Liberal government, the housing crisis continues to get worse. On the Liberals meeting their housing plan numbers, construction experts at committee have been saying there's not a chance, and they're not attainable. So also, according to a new Rentals.ca monthly rent report, asking prices for rent rose by 9.3% compared to this time last year. And after 9 years, rents have doubled. This Prime Minister has spent billions, but rent prices keep increasing and building keeps decreasing. How can this Prime Minister spend so much and achieve so little?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the member ought to know again that in order to deal with the housing crisis in this country, we do need to see another 3.87 million homes built in this country. That's the number of homes that need to be built to address the housing crisis. It's incumbent on the federal government, provincial governments, municipal governments to put in place measures to address that crisis. If the member is serious, then she and her party will support this government in the measures that we're responsible for, waiving GST on purpose-built rentals and putting in place missing middle housing measures, working with municipalities to make that happen. They're opposed to it every single time.
The Honourable Member for Repentigny. The CEOs of the 5 biggest oil companies appeared before the Environment Committee yesterday, and they were unapologetic. They don't care about the oil industry's increasing emissions. They all defended their record profits of $38 billion since 2020, money made from pollution. And despite their full pockets, they're still begging for more public money. These companies don't deserve a penny of the $83 billion in tax breaks the federal government is giving them over 10 years. Will the government cut them off and reinvest in climate change adaptation? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the work of this member on the committee and here in the House as well. But, Mr. Speaker, we are the only country of the G20 to have scrapped the subsidy to oil companies 2 years before the deadline. And we also announced a fund a $530 million fund with the Canadian Federation of Municipalities to work with our communities all across the country to fight climate change. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member for Repentigny. While Ottawa hands out $83 billion to the oil patch, people affected by climate change are still waiting for compensation. There's been nothing for farmers whose crops were devastated last year by natural disasters. Baie Saint Paul is still waiting for compensation for last year's floods, despite the superhuman efforts of my colleague for Beauport, Côte-de-Beaupré, Île-d'Orléans, Charlevoix. While the Weather Channel is predicting another high-risk summer for natural disasters, the federal government has yet to provide compensation for last year's disasters. Why are they so quick and generous with oil companies and so slow and stingy with real people? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thanks again for the question, Mr. Speaker, and once again, I appreciate the work of this member, and this new funding that I just mentioned will support over 1,400 projects to help municipalities adapt to climate change. Mr. Speaker, over the past 2 years, we have implemented a number of projects, things that the Conservatives never managed to do, but they changed their mind. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Caribou, Prince George.
After 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, most young Canadians believe they'll never be able to afford a home. Under this Prime Minister, housing prices have doubled. Mortgage payments doubled. The needed down payment doubled. This week, Rentals.ca reported the average rent in Canada has reached over $2,200. This is the most expensive rent we have ever seen. Despite this, the NDP Liberal government is failing to build the homes that Canadians need. If this Prime Minister can't build the affordable homes that Canadians need, will he get out of the way so Conservatives can?
Yeah!
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing.
We won't let that happen, Mr. Speaker. They have no vision on housing. They want to tax home builders, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to working with municipalities to see more zoning changes so we can see fourplexes, duplexes, triplexes, mid-rise apartments, all of these things built in communities, they don't want to support that either. Like the member for Kelowna, he voted against those measures. And just yesterday, for the first time in 30 years, we saw an investment in co-op housing that will lead to more homes. But what do they think about co-op housing, Madam Speaker? They believe it's Soviet-style housing. They don't believe in that, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, just 2 days ago, the Deputy Prime Minister was boasting about housing in her usual modest way. She's so out of touch with the reality of most Canadians because there's no getting away from the facts. The average rent is $2,200, up almost 10%. A two-bedroom apartment, up 12%, $2,233. That's the rent. That's a Liberal record after 9 years. This government, they're real champs when it comes to announcements, but results, not so much. After all these announcements, when are they going to deliver some real results after 9 years of doing nothing? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to remind the member that while his leader was Minister of Housing, he created 6 housing units. 6 housing units. The plan that we put in place will deliver 3.8 million housing units in the next few years. Mr. Speaker, here on this side of the House, we're helping people pay their rent, build housing, and ensure that people are not on the street. We're helping people get off the streets and into shelters. Mr. Speaker, we will continue to work for all Canadians.
Mr. Speaker, Corrections Canada has a mandate to retrain Canada's 10,000 inmates so they can find employment upon release. In the past 3 years, Corrections has issued 112,000 meaningless in-house vocational certificates and a grand total of 64 Red Seal certifications. Corrections has also made zero effort to engage in provincial apprenticeship programs, which could produce life-saving or life-changing certified job skills, reduce recidivism, and be beneficial to everyone in the community. Why this neglect?
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, I certainly share our colleagues' focus on the importance of vocational training and skills upgrading for those that are serving in federal correctional facilities. I had a chance with my colleague, the Parliamentary Secretary, and the member for Kingston to visit the Joyceville Institution in our colleagues' riding, to meet people from Corcan that are working and see inmates taking programs that will improve their skills training and hopefully set them up for success when they're released from those institutions. And we'll continue to do everything that's necessary to preserve public safety, because this is an important element of that work as well.
Absolutely. The honourable member for Yukon.
Mr. Speaker, across the country, communities need new infrastructure to grow, build more homes, and enable economic growth. This is especially true in the north. Investing in our communities also means investing in our airports. Northerners want reliable, safe, and affordable service when it comes to air connectivity. Could the Minister of Transport please tell us what the government is doing to ensure that the communities in the north are more connected and more livable?
The Honourable Minister of Transport.
Mr. Speaker, the member for Yukon is not only excellent, he's also right. Investing in our communities means investing in our airports. Northern, remote, indigenous communities must have access to air services they need and they expect. This is why we invested $186 million to upgrade the infrastructure at the Eric Nielsen Whitehorse International Airport. We've got a plan to build a Canada that the next generation will be proud of. The Conservatives, well, they pretend to care about making life better for the next generation of Canadians. They just pretend. On our side, we're doing it.
Pretending, that's it, that's it.
The honourable member for Calgary Shepherd has caught my eye.
The Auditor General's explosive report on the NDP Liberal Green Slush Fund shows personal friends of the Prime Minister voted themselves millions in taxpayer cash. 96 cases of declared conflicts by board members where they still voted to award themselves that taxpayer cash, and another 90 they failed to disclose the conflict of interest and still then gave themselves the cash anyway. Now, will this NDP Liberal government release all the slush fund documents and call in the RCMP?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Innovation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the member for the question. SDTC is an organization that served the clean tech sector for over 20 years. We knew about, or when we knew about the allegations of mismanagement, our government acted immediately. There's a number of steps over the last many months that our government has taken to get to the bottom of the issues in terms of the governance and HR practices of the organization. I think it's important to keep in mind this is an arm's length organization. It operated independently of government oversight. We're now folding it into the National Research Council and installing a more robust governance framework.
The honourable member for Calgary Shepherd.
Speaker, that member's response doesn't make any sense. This organization in 2017 got a clean bill of health from the Auditor General. Then when they took it over, they dumped the chair within 3 days, a record number. And that new board member, Doug Arden, well, she gave her own company $217,000 to a company she had a direct relationship with. So the question remains, will this government then release all of the documents connected to this slush fund and call in the RCMP?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, it's appropriate for us all as a government and members of Parliament to demand the highest governance standards when dealing with public funds. That's what our government has done from day one. As soon as we learned about allegations of mismanagement in this independent organization, we ordered independent reviews done, fact-finding missions. We collaborated with the Auditor General in her review, and now we're moving forward with the recommendations that the Auditor General has made, which includes folding the organization in to have better transparency, accountability, and oversight.
The honourable member for Northumberland, Peterborough South.
The reality is that there's $123 million worth of inappropriately awarded contracts, $76 million given to Liberal insiders, resignations, abuse, a leadership team that seemed far more interested in protecting Liberal cabinet ministers than Canadian taxpayer dollars. This is the legacy of the failed Green Slush Fund. When will this Liberal government give up the cover-up and call in the Mounties?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Well, of course, Mr. Speaker, that question has just been answered repeatedly by my colleague, but I can't let this opportunity or this week go by without punctuating some of the great economic news that we've seen. A loud reduction in the Interest Rates Canada leading the world in interest rate reductions. And today, we've seen that we've now recovered 141% of the jobs that were lost in the first months of the pandemic, compared to just 128% in the United States. And importantly, Mr. Speaker, there are more than 1.3 million more Canadians employed than at any time before the pandemic.
The honourable member for Châteauguay-Lacolle.
Have dominated the online space for years. For far too long, they have got away without contributing their fair share to the audiovisual sector and Canadian creators while generating millions in revenues from their work. Our government passed historic legislation last year to level the playing field between platforms and creators. Can the Minister of Heritage provide this House with an update on the implementation of the Online Streaming Act?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
I want to thank the member for an important question. Indeed, this week the CRTC released its decision on initial contributions by global streamers as part of the implementation of the Online Streaming Act. This means digital platforms will contribute nearly $200 million per year to our audio and audiovisual sectors, including content creators. Unlike the Conservatives who defend tech giants and obstruct all attempts supporting Canadian industries, we are standing up for Canadian artists and good-paying jobs. The Online Streaming Act is about fairness for our creators, leveling the playing field, more Canadian jobs and content made for us, by us. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for South Okanagan West Kootenay.
Mr. Speaker, the BC communities of Merritt, Princeton, and Abbotsford were devastated by floods in 2021. 5 people were killed, thousands forced from their homes, farmland flooded, roads, bridges, and other structures destroyed. At the time, the Prime Minister said that he had the backs of these Canadians. Now these same communities have been denied funding to mitigate future disasters. So, will the minister live up to his promises and provide these communities with the funds they need to rebuild and prevent more devastating floods?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Emergency Preparedness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Honourable Member for his question. The 2021 floods and landslides had a devastating impact on communities across the lower disaster financial assistance range. We have now provided over $1.4 billion to the province to help them recover from those floods alone. The program allows the province to put $210 million to reduce the vulnerability of mitigation projects like dikes and pumps. We will continue to work closely with the province in all capabilities that they need and in terms of making sure that they can fully recover. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Spadina Fort York.
Speaker, Canadians will never get over nor accept the betrayal of their country's democracy by traitors who sell themselves out for personal and political gain. Instead of shielding subversives on the payroll of foreign operators, will the government release the cabinet documents to the Hogue Inquiry and the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians so such individuals can be investigated? Or is it the case, Mr. Speaker, that the Liberal Party doesn't want to incriminate itself?
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, just because our colleague makes something up doesn't make it true. He knows very well,
and he's used to
Speaker, that our government has worked collaboratively with the Hogue Commission. In fact, the officials from the Privy Council office are in regular and ongoing contact with the lawyers from the Hogue Commission to ensure that they have, of course, all of the appropriate and relevant documents to do the important work that all recognized parties in this House supported. We obviously look forward to working in a continued way with the National Security Committee of Parliamentarians. My colleague should be careful before he makes up things in the House of Commons.
Absolutely.
And that's all the time we have for question period today.